Hey there, sleepyhead. Before we start, maybe fluff your pillow. Take a slow breath, and remember, this isn't meant to excite you. It's just a bedtime ramble through the most ancient stories we barely remember. So close your eyes, if you like. No action scenes here. Just clouds, voids, and a few long-winded gods. Let's begin. Long before people had cities or calendars, before olive oil was drizzled on anything, there was simply nothing. Not the kind of nothing that feels like a day off, but a very official, mythologically sanctioned chaos. Not a mess. Not a riot. Just a vast, yawning emptiness. If you've ever stared into a fogged-up mirror and forgotten why you were there, you're getting close. From this most respectable nothing came the first somethings. Slowly, as if trying not to wake the neighbors, a few shapes began to suggest themselves. Not like shapes you could draw, more like categories of existing. First came Gaia, the earth, not a planet, just the idea of ground with a vague sense of moss. She stretched herself out across the void and presumably sighed. Then came Tartarus, the deep, dark under-earth, not evil, just low and somewhat sulky. If Gaia was a blanket, Tartarus was the crumb-covered floor underneath it. Eros followed not the kind from perfume ads, but a primordial force of gentle attraction, the kind that might convince fog to settle over a lake. He didn't say much, but his presence meant things might start sticking together in mildly interesting ways. There was also Erebus' shadow, without a lamp, and Nyx's night, without stars. Nyx was one of the more motivated entities, and she began spawning all sorts of moody children. Sleep-death, doom-blame, and boredom, each one as emotionally complex as a damp cave. You'll meet them later, if you stay awake that long. Meanwhile, Gaia was feeling generative. She didn't wait around for dating apps. She simply created Uranus the sky. He drifted above her like a lazy blue bedsheet, occasionally rumbling. Gaia and Uranus, as Earth and sky, developed a working relationship. Their collaboration was productive, though not necessarily happy. Together, and somewhat inexplicably, they began to generate children. Lots of them. The first batch were called the Titans, tall and moody, with excellent posture. There were 12, because 12 is a number that looks good on murals. There was Oceanus, who became the idea of water, going all the way around things. Hyperion, who eventually stood in for sunlight, although he was more of a glow than a beam. Iapetus, who sounded important, but mostly loitered. and Cronus, who looked at clocks before clocks were invented. The girls were equally conceptual, Theia, Menemazina, and Rhea, among others. They were cosmic, abstract, and generally underappreciated. Now Uranus wasn't a model parent. He didn't like his children very much, especially the later ones, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, who had slightly alarming resumes. So he stuffed them back inside Gaia, which she found neither polite nor comfortable. Eventually, Gaia had enough. She recruited her youngest Titan, Cronus, for a bit of quiet insurrection. Armed with a sickle made from indignant stone, Cronus waited until Uranus drifted a little too low. What happened next was considered shocking, at least by ancient Greek standards, which is saying something. Cronus ambushed Uranus, separated him from some essential masculinity, and scattered the remnants into the sea. From those sea foam remains, by the way, came Aphrodite. But she's not on stage yet. For now, she's floating somewhere near Cyprus, humming. With Uranus decommissioned, Cronus took over. He married his sister Rhea because it was a simpler time and began ruling the world. He was careful, perhaps, overly so. A prophecy warned him that one of his children would overthrow him, just like he did to dear old Dad. So whenever Rhea gave birth, Cronus calmly swallowed the child, not out of malice, just as a preventative measure, like taking vitamins. This worked well enough for the first 5 children: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Into the belly they went. No fuss, no furniture. But when child number 6 came along, Zeus, Rhea had second thoughts. Understandable, really. She tricked Cronus by wrapping a rock in baby clothes. Cronus, perhaps distracted, swallowed it whole, which says something about the dining standards of Titans. Rhea smuggled baby Zeus away to a cave on Crete, where he was raised by nymphs, goats, and gentle narrators, like me. He grew up strong, loud, and determined to cause family drama. But that, dear listener, is for stage 2. For now, rest your mind among the Titans, suspended in a cosmos that hasn't quite decided what it wants to be. Nothing is urgent here. Everything happens slowly, on a scale that makes glaciers look impulsive. You don't need to remember the names. Just know that once before gods wore sandals or used lightning, there was chaos. And from that, eventually, came bedtime stories, like this one. While Cronus was still ruling the cosmos with a firm, slightly nervous grip somewhere beneath the relatively new sun on the island of Crete, baby Zeus was being quietly overfed by a goat named Amalthea. She wasn't a symbolic goat. She was just a goat doing her best. Her milk, though unpasteurized, was apparently divine enough to nourish an Olympian. And while most babies cried, or drooled, Zeus, being mythologically gifted, occasionally shook the cave roof when he sneezed. To prevent Cronus from hearing these dramatic nasal eruptions, a group of local nymphs employed a clever technique. They clanged bronze shields and danced very loudly every time Zeus made a noise. No one slept much, but the cosmos remained uninvaded by paranoid fathers, which was the main goal. Zeus, growing up in this echoing goat and shield environment, developed a taste for drama and a sense of entitlement that was entirely appropriate for someone destined to become king of the gods. Eventually, he reached what can only be described as mythological adulthood, which means he had a beard, a thunderbolt on back order, and a general attitude of, I should be in charge. With this newfound confidence, Zeus set out to confront his father. Not in a hurry, just gradually, like a god who's read all the prophecies and wants to savor the inevitability. Along the way, he picked up some allies. There was Meta, a clever titaness whose main skill was wisdom in quantities too large for casual conversation. She gave Zeus a drink laced with a gentle emetic brewed from herbs and inevitability. Zeus, now pretending to be an up-and-coming servant or a mysterious bartender, approached Cronus and offered him the drink. Cronus, still operating under the assumption that everything was fine, accepted it. What followed was not elegant. One by one, Cronus began to regurgitate the children he had swallowed long ago. First came Hestia, a bit startled, but otherwise composed. Then Demeter, brushing off cosmic lint. Hera emerged frowning. Hades and Poseidon followed, both slightly annoyed, but grateful to be in the open air again. They had no memory of the inside of their father's stomach, but they all agreed it hadn't been well decorated. Remarkably, they emerged in reverse order of consumption, and more or less fully grown. Because time works differently inside Titans, and also because Greek myths don't concern themselves too heavily with digestive logic. Now, with all 6 siblings standing in formation, the family reunion turned toward revolution. Cronus, realizing the prophecy, was now circling like a lazy vulture called upon his fellow Titans for backup. A great war began, though it happened over many slow-moving centuries and involved a lot of shouting from mountain peaks. The gods, now called the Olympians, because they had sublet a scenic mountain, fought from Mount Olympus. The Titans, led by Cronus, fought from Mount Othrys, which no one remembers, because they lost. The war, known as the Titanomachy, though not by anyone who wanted to pronounce it correctly, lasted 10 years, which, in God time, is just long enough to forget why it started. The battles were described as vast and thunderous, but no one ever explains who cleaned up afterward. Thunder clashed with time, stone met sky, and metaphors collided midair. It was all very majestic in a sleepy, theatrical way. Zeus, not content with standard God-on-Titan combat, decided to recruit some help from the underworld. He remembered those siblings Cronus had banished before the swallowing phase, the 100-handed ones, and the Cyclopes. These were not easy dinner guests. The 100-handed ones were large, misunderstood, and always in the way. But they were strong. The Cyclopes were excellent smiths and very nearsighted. In exchange for their freedom, they gave Zeus gifts. One of them, a thunderbolt prototype, which sparked gently and hummed with dormant violence. To Poseidon, they gave a trident that rattled when angry. Hades received a helmet that turned him invisible, though he mostly used it to leave awkward meetings. Armed with these tools and a renewed sense of cosmic superiority, the Olympians turned the tide of the war. Cronus, after several loud but symbolic defeats, was overthrown and presumably placed in a kind of retirement cave with limited responsibilities and no access to family gatherings. The Titans, depending on their level of involvement and grumpiness, were either imprisoned in Tartarus, sentenced to long naps, or quietly forgotten. Victory secured Zeus held a meeting, his first of many, and decided to split up the cosmos. Being eldest, or perhaps just loudest, he claimed the sky. Poseidon took the sea, although he grumbled that it was too wet. Hades accepted the underworld with mild suspicion, but made the best of it. The earth, oddly enough, remained communal, like a shared backyard, with no one mowing the lawn. Thus began the age of the Olympians. The gods were now in charge, which meant the universe was run by a collection of overly dramatic siblings with unpredictable tempers and no clear managerial experience. But for now, everything was stable. Gaia, the earth, still rumbled gently. Tartarus sulked quietly. And Zeus, seated on a throne that squeaked whenever he moved, began considering what to do next. He looked out over the clouds, cradling his borrowed thunderbolt, and thought to himself that things were going surprisingly well. Of course, he hadn't met humans yet, or Prometheus, or his own thoughts about immortality and succession. But that, as the stars flickered slowly into place above, Olympus was a matter for another stage entirely, one that would unfold with the gentle insistence of a myth, pretending not to be inevitable. Now that Zeus had set himself comfortably upon a cloud-fluffed throne atop Mount Olympus, which was only slightly drafty and largely uninsulated, he began the slow business of arranging the universe to suit his rather thunderous tastes. The sky being his primary concern was rearranged into more reliable schedules, sunrise at a consistent hour, lightning reserved for dramatic pauses, and stars placed like decorative thumbtacks above. The sea was left mostly to Poseidon, who did not decorate so much as churn, and the underworld fell to Hades, who took to bookkeeping with a grim satisfaction. The earth, however, was still mostly unoccupied, save for a few decorative goats and a scattered population of dryads who were shy, leafy, and slightly judgmental. It was into this relatively blank landscape that the gods decided, rather passively, to introduce something new humanity. The exact committee responsible for this idea remains vague. Some myths point to Gaia, others to Zeus, and yet others suggest it may have been the result of a particularly slow day on Olympus when no one wanted to invent another minor river god. In any case, the task of shaping these new beings fell to Prometheus, a titan who had managed to avoid the unpleasantness of Tartarus through a combination of diplomacy, disinterest, and being generally useful. Prometheus, whose name meant something like forethought, or perhaps he who thinks about consequences just enough to cause problems, took his job very seriously. He knelt beside a riverbank with a quiet sort of purpose, scooping up damp clay and shaping the first humans with the care of someone trying to remember what knees looked like. His brother, Epimetheus, whose name more or less meant oops, helped by handing him tools in the wrong order. Eventually, a series of lumpy but earnest humans stood blinking in the sunlight. They were not impressive. They had no feathers, no scales, no claws, and a general look of soft confusion. But Prometheus loved them immediately, perhaps too much. He watched them stumble about, shivering in the evening wind, scratching at insect bites, and trying to invent the concept of bread with 2 rocks and an undercooked root. Zeus, from his cloudy seat, watched too, but with less fondness. The humans were amusing at first. They sang to the sky, offered him tuer, and occasionally fell into rivers in ways that entertained passing naiads. But their helplessness became tiresome. And so, when Prometheus approached Zeus with a request that humans be given fire that warm, flickering comfort previously reserved for divine banquets and poorly supervised volcanic vents, Zeus frowned. Not out of hatred, just caution. He was a new ruler, after all, and rulers didn't like handing out power, even in small, crackling bundles. Fire meant warmth. It meant cooking. It meant invention, ambition, and potentially metaphors. Zeus wasn't ready for metaphors, so he said no. Politely, but firmly. Prometheus, however, did not operate on no. He operated on, I'll figure it out. And so, One quiet evening, while Olympus was distracted by a musical debate between Apollo and a goat-footed satyr, Prometheus crept into the sacred hearth, tucked a flame into a fennel stalk, because fennel, when dried, is conveniently fibrous and descended to earth. There, he offered fire to humanity, not with fanfare, just a flickering gift passed hand to hand until the first stew boiled and the first night grew a little less terrifying. The humans rejoiced. They danced badly. They burned things accidentally. They built small fireside circles and invented storytelling without realizing it. They sang awkwardly. They made smoke. They made ash. They made mistakes. But above all, they made progress. Zeus noticed. He always did. The sky darkened just a touch, not with weather, but with mood. He was not furious, not yet, but deeply inconvenienced. Punishing Prometheus directly would have been simple, but Zeus preferred a layered approach. First, he instructed Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, to craft something new, something beautiful, deceptive, and mildly vengeful. Thus came Pandora, a woman, formed from clay, like the humans, but with divine polish. Each god gave her a gift. Aphrodite gave beauty. Hermes gave cunning. Hera gave curiosity, wrapped tightly in lace. Zeus gave her a jar, not quite a box, though later generations would confuse the two. Into the jar, the gods placed all manner of things, suffering hunger, jealousy, hiccups, bad weather. During weddings, the sensation of stepping on something sharp in socks, all the discomforts previously missing from the human condition. Pandora, as designed, was gifted to Epimetheus. Prometheus, always suspicious, warned his brother not to accept divine gifts. But Epimetheus, whose memory was roughly 5 minutes long, smiled, thanked everyone, and married her anyway. Eventually, inevitably, Pandora opened the jar, not out of malice, but mild curiosity mixed with poor lid design. The contents whooshed out like bees from a polite but relentless hive and spread across the world. Misery, hunger, heartbreak, tax collectors all drifted into the human sphere. Pandora, horrified, tried to close the jar, managing to trap only one last thing: hope. It remained inside, flickering faintly at the bottom, uncertain whether it was supposed to be comforting or ironic. As for Prometheus, Zeus finally turned his attention back to the Titan, who had started all this messy progress. He did not kill him. That would have been too clean. Instead, Prometheus was chained to a rock somewhere high, somewhere remote, somewhere with terrible Wi-Fi. Each day, an eagle arrived to nibble gently but persistently at his liver, which regenerated overnight due to divine biology and a lack of better ideas. Prometheus endured, not stoically, not dramatically, just continuously. Each day, the eagle came. Each day, the liver grew back. The rock did not shift. The chains did not loosen. The punishment, like most celestial bureaucracy, was designed to last indefinitely. Meanwhile, back among the humans, fire crackled on. Tools were sharpened, pots were invented, bread was almost figured out. Hope remained quietly sealed in its jar, and Zeus from Olympus began to consider whether he had truly won or merely delayed the inevitable invention of something even more inconvenient than fire, while Prometheus lay quietly shackled to his wind-whipped rock and endured the daily dietary interest of a persistent eagle. Zeus returned to Olympus, not triumphant, not angry, but pensive. The humans had fire now. They were building things, uneven huts, awkward tools, songs with too many verses. They were learning too quickly, and even with all the pestilence and heartbreak Pandora's jar had introduced, they continued onward like ants who didn't know when to stop. Zeus watched from the clouds occasionally, raising an eyebrow at their clumsy festivals in his honor. He wasn't sure whether to be flattered or mildly offended. Meanwhile, his fellow Olympians settled into their respective departments with the slow enthusiasm of demigods adjusting to cubicles. Poseidon polished his trident and stirred up whirlpools, mostly for fun. Hades categorized shades of darkness and considered expanding the underworld to accommodate the increasing traffic of mortal souls. Hera, sister and wife to Zeus, maintained her station with measured dignity and a growing sense that marriage was more complicated when your husband had control of the skies and very little impulse control. For while Zeus had claimed Hera as queen, he had also taken a scenic approach to loyalty, wandering the earth, disguised as bulls, swans, and drifting breezes, fathering children with nymphs, mortals, and anyone who didn't ask too many questions. Hera noticed. She always noticed. She did not yell. She did not storm. She simmered, slow and enduring, like a clay pot over eternal flame. Her wrath, when it arrived, was rarely loud, but it was thorough. She disliked rivals, despised illegitimate offspring, and developed a reputation for transforming people into cows, birds, or newts, depending on the severity of the offense. Back on Olympus, Zeus, despite his affairs and occasional lightning tantrums, had begun to worry, not about the humans or Hera, but about something more personal, a whisper of fate, a prophecy muttered by Gaia herself, or perhaps murmured through a crack in the earth, suggested that one day a child of Zeus would overthrow him. It was vague, as all prophecies were, but unsettling nonetheless. The idea burrowed into Zeus's divine skull like a polite but persistent termite. He had, after all, overthrown his own father. Was it not reasonable to imagine his own children might one day do the same? He began slowly to regard paternity not as a blessing, but as a hazard. The first child to cause concern was Athena, though her birth was unusual enough to warrant its own category. Zeus, at some point, had swallowed Métis, the titaness of wisdom and thoughtful planning. He did this not out of hunger, but precaution. She, too, had been tied to a prophecy about producing a powerful child. Métis, however, did not vanish. She remained growing quietly inside Zeus's head, offering advice in subtle, internal whispers. Over time, these whispers developed into pressure, then into pounding, then into something more tectonic. Eventually, Zeus called upon Hephaestus, god of fire and awkward family dynamics, to relieve him of what felt like a migraine forged in eternity. Hephaestus, not one to question divine surgery, took up an axe and gently opened Zeus's forehead like an extremely serious walnut. Out leapt Athena, fully grown, clad in armor, and looking moderately prepared for a courtroom battle, or at least a very formal debate. She blinked, saluted, and joined the pantheon without fuss. Zeus was relieved. Athena was loyal-wise and showed no signs of rebellion, at least not immediately. But still, the prophecy lingered. Next came Apollo and Artemis twins, born to the titaness Leto, who had spent much of her pregnancy avoiding Hera's wrath and wandering through increasingly inconvenient landscapes. When the twins were finally born, Apollo radiant and musical, Artemis reserved and precise. Zeus watched them closely. They were skilled, too skilled. Apollo charmed everything that moved invented instruments and knew the names of stars that hadn't been discovered yet. Artemis demanded wilderness, wild animals, and personal space in generous amounts. They were not dangerous, not yet, but they were impressive, and that was almost worse. Zeus started cataloging his children like a cautious librarian, organizing a very mischievous shelf. There was Hermes, born with sandals that had wings and a tongue that moved faster than reason. Within hours of birth, he had stolen cattle, invented the lyre, and negotiated forgiveness with such charm that even Apollo had to admire him. Hermes was not threatening. He was far too distracted, but his cleverness left Zeus mildly winded. Then there was Ares, god of war and occasional tantrums, who managed to make everything into a battlefield. He was loud, impulsive, and constantly bruised. Zeus considered him more of a cautionary tale than a threat, but kept an eye on him just the same. Hephaestus. Poor limping. Hephaestus had been flung from Olympus as an infant by Hera, or by Zeus, depending on which version the clouds were humming that day. He had returned later, grudgingly welcomed, and spent most of his time making beautiful, slightly melancholic inventions in his forge. He was unlikely to overthrow anyone, but his tools might enable someone who would. And then there were the others, the demigods, the nymph-born sons, the mortal daughters who glowed slightly at dusk, too many to count, and all scattered across the earth like seeds blown from an anxious orchard. Zeus began to understand why Cronus had resorted to swallowing. It was simpler than remembering birthdays. Still, he tried to control the chaos, not with tyranny, but with gifts. He built temples for those who worshipped. He sent omens to guide or confuse. He ruled with a mixture of applause and punishment, doling out thunder as both warning and applause. But the whisper never left him. The child who would overthrow him might already be walking the earth, or singing in a meadow, or building a spear, or perhaps not born at all. And so he watched and planned. And somewhere, far beneath the clouds, in a cave forgotten by time, a certain hero had just taken his first breath. Far below, the cautious clouds of Olympus, in the land where myths occasionally touched dirt and forgot their own endings, mortals began to do what mortals always do. They lived loudly and clumsily. Some farmed, some fished, some argued with goats, and some, though they didn't know it at the time, began walking the long, crooked paths that would someday earn them a place among the stories. These were the heroes, not yet famous, not yet statue-worthy, just very determined and slightly confused individuals who happened to be born at inconvenient intersections of divine meddling and local politics. The gods, particularly Zeus, had taken a curious interest in humanity. Despite the prophecy that one of his children might overthrow him, Zeus could not resist wandering among mortals in various disguises and fathering children that were almost always stronger than average, handsomer than advisable, and destined to attract the attention of monsters, oracles, and overly ambitious kings. One of the first such mortals was Perseus, a child born from a golden rain. That may sound poetic, but it was actually Zeus who had transformed into said precipitation to visit a locked tower where the Princess Danae had been stashed to prevent pregnancy. This effort unsurprisingly failed. Danae gave birth to Perseus in secret, but secrets rarely stay buried in myth. The king Danae's father, upon discovering this golden grandson, decided to avoid complications by sealing mother and child in a wooden chest and casting it into the sea, a parenting technique that has not gained modern popularity. The chest, being buoyant and plot important, washed ashore on an island where Perseus grew up among fishermen. Nets and vague knowledge of his divine origin. Years later, he found himself roped into a dangerous errand by a local king with too much beard and too little tact. The task: retrieve the head of Medusa, a gorgon whose gaze could turn onlookers into tasteful statues. This was not a metaphor. It was very literal. Medusa, once beautiful and now cursed, lived far from polite society, surrounded by the kind of ambiance that discouraged casual visits. Perseus, unfazed and slightly underinformed, accepted the quest. The gods, never ones to ignore a juicy subplot, intervened with gifts. Athena offered a polished shield, which functioned like a very shiny mirror, and less like an actual shield. Hermes provided winged sandals, perfect for high-altitude detours and last-minute escapes. Hades contributed a helm of invisibility, though it came with no instructions. Perseus, equipped with this mythological starter kit, traveled far, endured vague riddles, borrowed tools from terrifying nymphs, and eventually confronted Medusa in a scene that was more sneaking than fighting. Using the shield as a mirror, he avoided her gaze, and with a single swing of a borrowed blade, removed her head. It was an inelegant moment. There was no speech, no flourish, just a wet sound and a sudden hush. From Medusa's neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a name like a cough. This birth, while dramatic, did not distract Perseus, who placed the severed head in a bag and began his slow journey home. Along the way, he accidentally petrified sea monsters, angered kings, and rescued Andromeda, a princess chained to a rock, as monster, bait, an unfortunate position that was surprisingly common in ancient storytelling. Andromeda, grateful and slightly stunned, agreed to marry him. Together, they returned, threw the petrifying head at those who had wronged them, and lived reasonably ever after. Zeus, from his throne, watched with a kind of fatherly amusement. Perseus was competent, bold even, but not ambitious enough to challenge Olympus. Not yet. Other heroes began to stir, born of similar divine interruptions. One such child was Heracles, more commonly rendered in Roman spelling as Hercules. But we shall remain Greek, if only to maintain continuity and confuse the occasional listener. Heracles was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman, whose husband was away just long enough for Zeus to impersonate him and extend one evening into several. Alcmene, unaware, gave birth to twins, one divine, one entirely mortal. Heracles, the divine twin, was marked early for difficulty. Hera, Zeus's ever-watchful wife, noticed the affair and made it a personal mission to ruin this child's life, not through violence, but through paperwork labor and general emotional turbulence. As an infant, Heracles strangled 2 serpents sent to his crib. As a youth, he broke every piece of training equipment. As a young man, he was cursed with madness, during which he accidentally harmed those closest to him, a tragedy that led to his penance, which came in the form of the 12 labors. These labors were not optional. They were assigned by a cousin king with a suspiciously smug expression, and they were designed to be impossible. Heracles accepted them with a sigh and a club. The tasks ranged from slaying the Nemean lion, whose hide was impervious to weapons, to capturing the Erymanthian boar, which had no clear motivation other than trampling vineyards. He also had to clean the Augean stables, which housed more divine manure than anyone could reasonably imagine. Heracles diverted a river. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Each labor became more complex, less about brute strength, and more about patience, trickery, and the ability to handle bad directions from oracles. He wrestled, hunted, cleaned, captured, and at one point fetched a golden apple from a garden, guarded by immortality and bureaucracy. Zeus again observed. Heracles was strong, too strong, but easily distracted. He did not seek Olympus. He sought relief. That was acceptable. That was manageable. Other names began to whisper through the clouds. Theseus, who would one day enter a labyrinth with thread. Jason, who would chase a golden fleece with a boat full of problematic friends. Orpheus, who would try to sing the dead back to life and almost succeed. The age of heroes was beginning, not in trumpets or banners, but in awkward births, unfortunate prophecies, and small decisions that led to very large consequences. Zeus leaned back, thunderbolt resting beside him like a sleepy dog, and wondered if he was watching the rise of greatness, or just the slow unraveling of his carefully threaded sky. As the age of heroes expanded like a leisurely sunrise across the mythological landscape, their names began to collect in dusty amphorae carved into stone and muttered across olive groves by shepherds who only half believed them. Zeus continued to observe from his elevated seat, surrounded by clouds that shaped themselves into animals when no one was looking. His concern over succession had not faded, but the mortal realm had grown crowded with semi-divine champions who seemed more interested in wrestling bulls and seducing local royalty than storming Olympus. Among these mortals, one name began to coil itself through the winding halls of destiny with the quiet certainty of an overconfident cat Theseus. His origins, like many in myth, were tangled. His mother Aethra had a quiet evening with Aegeus, the king of Athens, after a particularly confusing oracle consultation. That same night, depending on which scroll you believed and how recently it had been copied, Poseidon may have also visited Aethra. The result was a child whose bloodline included both royal awkwardness and divine dampness. Theseus grew up far from Athens, raised in Troezen, where he developed the broad shoulders and heroic frown typical of men destined to be mistaken for furniture by passing monsters. When he came of age, his mother revealed the truth of his lineage, or at least the Athenian half, and pointed him toward a large, heavy rock. Beneath the stone, Aegeus had hidden a sword and sandals, because that was the ancient Greek equivalent of a paternity test. Theseus lifted the rock, admired the sandals briefly, and set out for Athens by land, despite being told the sea route was safer and less infested with roadside villains. The land path was long and meandering, and Theseus, possessing the dramatic patience of a man who'd never seen a map, treated it like a walking resume. He confronted a series of bandits and mythological nuisances: Periphetes, with his iron club; Sinis, the pine bender; Skyron, who preferred to rob and foot-bathe his victims before flinging them off cliffs. Each was dispatched in ways that mirrored their own crimes, which says something about poetic justice, and even more about Theseus's sense of irony. By the time he reached Athens, word had spread. The city, caught in its usual mix of political uncertainty and deeply unhelpful festivals, welcomed him with a cautious enthusiasm. Aegeus, now grayer and slightly more anxious, was under the influence of Medea, who had recently relocated after her own series of unpleasant misunderstandings involving dragons' children and bad travel plans. Medea, sensing a threat to her position, tried to poison Theseus at a banquet. The plot was foiled at the last moment, not through cunning or confrontation, but because Aegeus recognized the sword Theseus carried, the same one he had left under the rock years ago. There was some rejoicing. There was probably wine. Medea left in a huff, and Theseus, now acknowledged, took up residence in Athens as the heir apparent. But Athens had its problems. Chief among them was the matter of tribute. Each year, the city was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, where they were fed to a creature known only as the Minotaur. This unfortunate arrangement was the result of past diplomatic errors and the complicated emotions of King Minos, ruler of Crete, who had once failed to sacrifice a bull to Poseidon and was punished by way of a monster. The Minotaur, half man and half bull, lived in the labyrinth, a massive structure designed by Daedalus, a craftsman so clever he often forgot why he started building things in the first place. The labyrinth was not a puzzle. It was a trap with a floor plan that changed moods. Those sent in did not come out. Theseus, hearing of this tradition, volunteered for the next tribute. Not because he was particularly noble, but because he had a fondness for problems that could be solved with sharp objects and inherited confidence. Upon arrival in Crete, he met Ariadne, daughter of King Minos. She was intelligent, quietly ambitious, and slightly bored. Theseus, with his travel-stained sandals and tragic jawline, made an impression. Ariadne offered to help him survive the labyrinth in exchange for a promise of marriage, or at least improved social standing. She gave him a ball of thread, simple, elegant, and easier to carry than most magical artifacts. Theseus entered the labyrinth with the thread tied to the entrance and began his descent. Inside the walls, pressed close, the air was warm and smelled faintly of old hay and mythological oversight. He found the Minotaur, not sleeping, not snarling, but simply existing, confused, hungry, and tragic, in a way only misunderstood monsters can be. The fight was not described in detail, only that it ended with the Minotaur slain, the thread unspooling, and Theseus emerging victorious, a little sweaty and slightly changed. He fled Crete with Ariadne, who brought her own opinions and a taste for better scenery. But on the island of Naxos, Theseus abandoned her. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps divine intervention, perhaps emotional immaturity, or maybe just a tragic narrative choice. Ariadne was later found by Dionysus, god of wine and impulsive celebrations, who married her and gave her a crown of stars. Theseus returned to Athens, but forgot in his grief or distraction to change the black sails on his ship to white, as he had promised his father. Aegeus, seeing the dark sails from a cliff, believed his son dead and threw himself into the sea, which was later named the Aegean in his honor. Theseus, now king, ruled Athens with the slow weariness of someone who had seen too many corridors and carried too many swords. His future held further complications: Amazonian invasions, diplomatic errands, personal tragedies, but those would come in time. For now, he stood atop a hill, crown slightly askew, wondering whether being a hero ever truly ended, or just changed shape. Far above Zeus considered this eugeneration. They were daring. They were clever. But they were at their core still mortals, flawed, distracted, and destined to forget important sail colors. And yet, he could feel the threads tightening. Another hero was on the horizon. His journey would involve a ship full of egos, a fleece that sparkled too much, and the kind of leadership that made maps nervous. While Theseus ruled Athens with a growing list of regrets and a cloak that rarely sat right elsewhere in the land of myth, somewhere east of sensible cartography, a young man named Jason was busy losing a sandal. This might seem like a trivial detail, but in mythology, footwear is often destiny. Jason, the son of Aeson, rightful king of Iolcus, had been hidden away as a child to protect him from Peleus, his ambitious uncle, who had a habit of securing power through unpleasant family reunions. Raised by the centaur, Chiron half-horse, full tutor, Jason was taught manners, medicine, and the basics of being heroic, including how to frown meaningfully and how to pose near waterfalls without looking too self-aware. When he came of age, Jason returned to Iolcus to reclaim his father's throne. He did not arrive with an army, but rather with confidence, and a single missing sandal having lost the other, while helping an old woman, who was actually Hera in disguise, across a muddy river. Peleus, noticing the one sandaled stranger, grew pale. An oracle had warned him to beware such a man. Jason, unaware of the prophecy, but fully committed to family negotiations, announced his lineage and politely requested the throne. Peleus, stalling with the skill of a practiced usurper, said Jason could have it after completing a simple errand. That errand was to retrieve the golden fleece, a shimmering relic from a magical ram that had once flown 2 children to safety and later been sacrificed because even miracle livestock don't get retirement plans. The fleece now hung in a sacred grove in Colchis, guarded by a never-sleeping dragon and a society that disliked visitors. Jason, either too brave or too uninformed to protest, agreed. But first, he needed a crew. He commissioned a ship, the Argo, named after its builder Argus, who was known for crafting vessels that creaked reassuringly and only leaked during festivals. With help from Athena, who contributed design suggestions and aesthetic opinions, the Argo was launched, a sleek vessel with a prow that spoke in riddles thanks to a piece of oak from Dodona's sacred grove. The crew, known as the Argonauts, assembled slowly, like a potluck of heroism. There was Heracles, who brought muscles and emotional baggage, Orpheus, who packed a lyre and a tendency to narrate feelings in song, Castor and Pollux, twin brothers with synchronized fighting styles and shared dialogue. Atalanta, a swift-footed woman warrior who made everyone slightly nervous and very impressed. And Meleager, Zeet's Calais, and a host of others whose names were difficult to spell, but whose resumes included monster-slaying poetry and casual meteorology. Together, they set sail, not in a straight line, but in a series of mythological detours that made the map look like someone had spilled wine on it and kept drawing anyway. First came Lemnos, an island where the women had, for various tragic and aromatic reasons, killed all their husbands. The Argonauts were welcomed distracted and delayed. Jason, being Jason, lingered. Eventually they left slightly better scented and vaguely late. They encountered Cyzicus, a hospitable king, who hosted them warmly, only for a tragic misunderstanding to lead to his death in a midnight skirmish. Morning followed, though not for long. The sea, after all, had more obstacles. At one point, they landed in a land plagued by harpies, winged creatures who treated every meal like a food fight and every prayer like a personal insult. The blind prophet Phineas, tormented daily by these feathered nuisances, offered guidance in exchange for relief. The Boreads, Zeets, and Calais, sons of the north wind, chased the harpies into the horizon, earning both gratitude and less interrupted meals. Phineas then warned them of the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, two great stone cliffs that smashed together randomly and with poor social awareness. To pass through the Argonauts released a dove. When it narrowly escaped, losing only a few tail feathers, they rowed with frantic precision, scraping the stern, but surviving. From there, the journey continued. Islands, storms, misunderstandings, minor deities offering cryptic advice. The Argonauts slowly bonded over shared snacks and spontaneous crises. Finally, after enough nautical miles to wear through the soles of sandals, they arrived in Colchis, a land of mystery gold and suspicious hospitality. King Aeetes, guardian of the Golden Fleece, was not impressed by Jason's quest. Rather than refuse outright, he proposed a challenge. Jason must yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, sow the soil with dragon's teeth, and then defeat the armed warriors that sprang from the earth. This was not a metaphor. Jason, whose qualifications leaned more toward team building than agriculture or pyrotechnics, was quietly panicking. Enter Medea, daughter of Aeetes, priestess of Hecate, and a woman whose resume included enchantments, potions, and dramatic exits. She saw Jason. Jason saw her. Something akin to fate, or at least mutual curiosity, settled in. With Hera's persuasion and a bit of divine nudging, Medea offered her help in exchange for Jason's love, or at least sincere attention. She provided a salve to protect him from the bull's flames, whispered strategy for defeating the warriors, and later led him to the fleece itself, which hung from an oak tree guarded by a dragon who rarely blinked. Some say Medea lulled the beast to sleep. Others suggest she simply asked nicely. Either way, Jason secured the fleece, and the two fled together, pursued by Aietes and consequences. Medea slowed the pursuit by sacrificing her brother Absyrtus, scattering his pieces in the sea to delay their father. It was effective. It was also not great for family dinners. The Argo sailed homeward, bearing Hero's fleece, and a story that was far from complete. Jason, triumphant but uneasy, had gained fame, a magical wife, and a relic that shimmered with both glory and foreshadowing. Back in Iolcus, however, Peleus was not eager to step aside. The throne was still warm, the politics still tangled. Medea, practical and vengeful, took matters into her own hands. She tricked Peleus's daughters into boiling him alive, a feat involving chopped lamb rejuvenation spells and miscommunication. The result was dramatic, messy, and frowned upon by the local Chamber of Commerce. Jason and Medea were exiled. Their journey, meant to end in triumph, unraveled into wanderings, betrayals, and eventually tragedy. But that lay further ahead. For now, the Argo bobbed quietly in port. Its crew disbanded its figurehead silent, and far above Zeus considered the heroes with a weathered patience. They were brave, they were clever, but they were also terribly mortal. His thoughts, ever drifting, now turned to another name, one shaped by music and mourning, destined to walk the underworld, not with a weapon, but with a song. While the Argo rested in its moorings, and Jason, once a celebrated hero, wandered through the fog of consequence, and Medea's increasingly uncontainable magic, another tale was tuning itself softly in the background, like a harp string, vibrating beneath silence. It belonged to Orpheus, son of Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and a father who may have been either a mortal king or a passing breeze with good posture. Regardless of lineage, Orpheus was born with music in his bones. From a young age, his lyre spoke for him in ways words could not. He played for the hills, the birds, and the rivers. He played for shepherds who forgot their flocks and nymphs who forgot their shyness. He played until even stones seemed to lean closer. The gods noticed. Apollo, who knew a thing or two about music and pride, gave Orpheus a lyre of divine craftsmanship and lessons that rarely ended on time. With this gift, Orpheus became more than a musician. He became a presence, a kind of sound that lingered in the air, long after the song had stopped. He traveled sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of kings and philosophers, but always with his music. When called to join Jason's crew aboard the Argo, he accepted, not with fanfare, but with a quiet nod and a lyre slung across his shoulder, like a polite reminder that not every hero carries a sword. During the voyage, it was Orpheus's music that calmed tempests, softened sorrow, and most notably saved the crew from the sirens, whose voices lured sailors to their doom, while others tied themselves to masts or stuffed wax in their ears. Orpheus simply played louder, his melodies folding over the siren's call like a protective blanket of sound. But that was then. That was before his most human story began. It began as many do with love. Her name was Eurydice, a dryad, or perhaps just a very gentle woman who lived close to trees and preferred the company of wild flowers to that of gods. Their love was soft, unhurried, and largely uneventful, which in myth is both rare and suspicious. They married in a meadow, perhaps, with bees attending, and sunlight filtering down like applause. But the world, as always, had other plans. On that same day, or perhaps just days, after Eurydice wandered too far, stepped on a snake, and died quickly, quietly, and entirely too soon. Orpheus did not wail. He did not rage. He simply stopped playing. The lyre fell silent. The birds paused. The rivers hesitated. And then, slowly, he turned his face toward the underworld. No one advised this. No oracle suggested it. He simply decided that music might reach further than most dared walk. So he descended, past groves where shades whispered, past the gates where Cerberus slept fitfully, past rivers with names like Lethe and Styx, where memory dissolved and oaths solidified. The underworld was not fire and punishment. It was gray, quiet, and organized. Souls moved like fog, and judges kept tallies with long sighs. Orpheus walked through it all with nothing but his lyre. At last, he reached Hades and Persephone's sovereigns of the realm. They listened as he played. Not words, not pleas, just music. A song shaped from absence and memory, the kind of melody that made rocks weep and time hold its breath. Even the Furies, with their iron eyes and eternally clenched hands, lowered their heads. When the song ended, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding. Hades, whose heart was buried deeper than his throne, granted a single condition: Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the world of the living, but only if he did not look back. Not once. Not until they both stood fully beneath the sun. It seemed simple. It was not. Orpheus turned and began the ascent. Behind him, he heard the faintest rustle, the softest echo of steps. He kept his eyes forward, climbing through the dim passageways with a focus so intense it barely felt like hope. But as the entrance neared, as light began to bloom faintly at the end of the corridor, doubt slipped in. Was she there? Was this another trick of the gods? Was he alone? He could not hear her breath, could not feel her presence. His fingers tightened on the lyre. The urge swelled slowly, then, all at once. At the threshold, just before stepping into daylight, he turned. She was there, eyes wide, one step behind. And then she was gone. No scream, no farewell, just a return to shadow. The rules had been clear. Orpheus emerged into the sun, not triumphant, but hollow. He did not curse the gods. He did not descend again. He wandered through forests that once danced to his music, through cities that now seemed too loud. His lyre, once full of life, now played only fragments, echoes of a song that would never resolve. He avoided women, spurned company, and spoke to no one. Eventually, in Thrace, a group of Maenads, followers of Dionysus, often enthusiastic to the point of destruction, tore him limb from limb. His head, still murmuring songs, floated down the river Hebrus, eventually reaching the island of Lesbos. There, some say it continued to sing, though less often than before. The gods, perhaps out of guilt, placed Orpheus's lyre in the sky as a constellation. It did not sing, but it shimmered faintly like the last note of a lullaby. And far above, on Olympus, Zeus pondered this. Not the tragedy itself, gods rarely dwelled on endings, but the persistence of love. The sheer absurdity of a mortal who thought music could change the underworld. It was noble. It was foolish. It was dangerous. And now, stirring faintly beneath shifting winds and sea spray, another name was forming, one that would carry war pride and the most fragile cargo of all beauty that launched 1,000 ships. As Orpheus's melody faded from riverbanks and memories alike, and his lyre shone faintly among the constellations with the kind of quiet dignity reserved for things no longer useful, but too beautiful to discard, the world turned slowly, and as always, toward its next mistake. It began not with war, but with a wedding. Specifically, the wedding of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph who had once been courted by Zeus himself until a prophecy mentioned that her child would be greater than his father. That was all Zeus needed to hear. He stepped away, whistled something that might have been casual avoidance, and instead arranged for her to marry a mortal, the idea being that any resulting child would remain properly terrestrial. Invitations were sent. The gods were summoned. The ceremony took place on Mount Pelion, a picturesque venue with manageable winds and a reputation for dramatic toasts. Everyone who was anyone in Olympus attended, except for Eris, goddess of discord, who had not been invited. Not out of malice, exactly, but out of cautious realism. Eris did not bring gifts. She brought complications. Insulted Eris arrived anyway late, and glittering with the kind of smug energy that turns banquets sour. She did not scream. She did not demand a plate. She simply rolled a golden apple into the crowd. It was inscribed with 3 gentle yet profoundly destabilizing words: to the fairest. Silence followed. 3 goddesses stepped forward: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each assuming with complete sincerity that the apple was meant for her. What followed was not a fight, but something worse: a disagreement between immortals. They turned to Zeus for judgment. But Zeus, who had seen this kind of situation before, declined with the speed of a god who had learned from Prometheus's headaches. Instead, he suggested the decision be left to a mortal. Paris, a Trojan prince, currently living in pastoral anonymity as a shepherd, thanks to a prophecy about burning cities and inconvenient children. Hermes, always willing to escort trouble, guided the 3 goddesses to Paris. One by one, they offered him bribes. Hera promised power and kingship over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in every battle. Aphrodite, with the sort of simplicity that usually required a second look, promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, who was neither a king nor a scholar, but very much an admirer of beauty, chose Aphrodite. The other 2 goddesses smiled thinly, made a few notes, and filed their resentment under to be addressed later. The woman Aphrodite had promised was Helen, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, and not currently looking for relocation. This did not deter Aphrodite. Through a series of gentle manipulations, festivals, and probably a few illusions, Paris visited Sparta, charmed Helen, and absconded with her back to Troy, or depending on the version she left, willingly enchanted by divine suggestion, or simply tired of the scenery. Either way, the result was the same. Helen vanished. Menelaus fumed, and the quiet winds of mythology stirred with anticipation. Back in Greece, Menelaus turned to his brother. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, a man with ambition, layered like pastry, and a voice that made silence nostalgic. Together, they invoked the old oaths, promises made years earlier when Helen had chosen her husband. Every suitor had sworn to defend her marriage, mostly as a way to avoid immediate conflict. Now those oaths came due. Messengers were sent. Alliances were invoked. Heroes were summoned, and the great Greek expedition began to form not yet a war, not yet a siege, but a gathering of names and destinies stitched together with obligation and the thin thread of insult. Among those summoned was Odysseus, clever king of Ithaca, who tried to avoid the war by pretending madness, sowing salt into his fields, and muttering to oxen. This ruse lasted until someone placed his infant son in front of the plow. Odysseus swerved, the child was safe, and his sanity was confirmed. He sighed, packed sensibly, and joined the cause. Achilles, too, was summoned, though not easily. His mother, Thetis, knowing his fate was tied to glory and early death, had hidden him away on the island of Scyros, disguised among women. This, while inventive, did not last. Odysseus uncovered the deception by presenting weapons and trinkets to the disguised Achilles, and watching which he preferred. Achilles chose the sword. The disguise unraveled. The war now had its finest warrior. Ships were assembled over 1,000, each creaking with anticipation and overpacked with ambition. The Greek fleet launched from Aulis, but was soon stalled by unfavorable winds, courtesy of Artemis, who had not been properly honored. A seer declared that the winds would not shift unless Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. After some pacing and quiet mumbling, Agamemnon agreed. Whether Iphigenia was truly sacrificed or whisked away by Artemis remains unclear. Such is the polite uncertainty of myth. But the winds did shift. The fleet sailed across the Aegean toward Troy, toward a city that had not yet woken to its doom. Meanwhile, on Olympus, the gods observed. Hera and Athena smoldered. Aphrodite hummed softly. Zeus remained outwardly neutral, though inwardly intrigued. He had not orchestrated this directly, but the pieces were moving in ways that reminded him of old prophecies. He wondered absently how many ships it would take to change the course of history, and whether any of them carried oarsmen who knew what they were truly rowing toward. On the shores of Troy, towers gleamed in the morning sun, and somewhere behind its walls, a king named Priam rose from sleep, unaware that his city's name would one day become synonymous with war lament, and a horse no one wanted to question too closely. Troy stood tall along the edge of the sea, its walls wide and watchful, its gates ancient and well-oiled by tradition, and its people still waking to the idea that they were now central to a divine disagreement that had started as many such disagreements do at a wedding no one remembered enjoying. Inside the city, King Priam ruled with the kind of tired wisdom that came from raising 50 sons and an undetermined number of daughters, many of whom had developed personalities inconvenient for diplomacy. Among these was Hector noble and dutiful commander of Troy's armies, and one of the few men on either side who treated war as a grim necessity rather than a heroic pastime. His younger brother, Paris, meanwhile, polished his armor and rehearsed speeches in front of mirrors, still not entirely sure whether he had won or lost something when he carried Helen back from Sparta. Helen herself, now called the face that launched 1,000 ships by poets. And the reason for all of this, by almost everyone else, moved through the palace with a grace that seemed rehearsed, her thoughts unreadable, and her heart somewhere between guilt and strange acceptance. Outside, Troy the Greek fleet finally arrived, sails full and stomachs empty, the long voyage replaced by the longer task of unloading egos, weapons, and increasingly elaborate tents. Agamemnon, commander of the coalition, stepped ashore with the air of someone expecting applause. Beside him, Menelaus scanned the walls for any sign of Helen, though it was far too early for meaningful glances. Achilles younger, but already restless, wandered among the ships with his companion, Patroclus, both of them frowning at logistics. Odysseus, meanwhile, quietly took notes. The war, for all its anticipated fury, began awkwardly. An early embassy was sent Menelaus Odysseus and a few others offering peace if Helen were returned. Priam listened, nodded, and consulted advisors, most of whom had already invested emotionally in the idea of a long siege. The offer was declined politely, but firmly. War it was, but not the kind that stormed gates on the first morning. The Greeks set up camp along the shoreline, building huts, counting spears, assigning ships to tribes, and learning quickly that most heroes did not thrive under group supervision. Raids began not on Troy itself, but on nearby towns and allies. Supplies were needed. Glory was gathered in pieces. Captives were taken. Among them were 2 women who would become symbolic far beyond their intentions. Chryseis given to Agamemnon, and Briseis awarded to Achilles. This arrangement lasted until Chryseis's father, a priest of Apollo, came to ransom her back. Agamemnon refused. Apollo, ever sensitive to disrespect, responded with plague arrows of disease falling silently among the Greeks until their moans outnumbered their complaints. A council was called. Tempers simmered. Odysseus, being the only adult in the room, suggested returning Chryseis. Agamemnon, pride wounded and beard bristling, agreed, but demanded Briseis from Achilles in compensation. Achilles, normally fond of drama, but not theft, fumed. He withdrew from battle, refused to fight, and retired to his tent, where he brooded with the kind of intensity that suggested poetry might happen. Without Achilles, the Greek forces faltered. Skirmishes continued, but momentum shifted. Troy, with Hector at the front, began to push back. Patroclus, seeing the despair among the Greeks, and knowing Achilles' stubbornness better than most, devised a plan. He borrowed Achilles' armor, an unmistakable set of bronze and bravado, and entered the battlefield disguised, hoping the illusion would inspire the troops, and perhaps force Achilles' hand. It worked for a while. The Greeks rallied. Troy wavered. But then Hector, in the thick of battle, met Patroclus. Believing him to be Achilles, he fought fiercely and struck him down. Only afterward did he see the truth. The Greeks retrieved the body. Word reached Achilles. What followed was not a speech or a vow, but a silence so sharp it made the sea pause. He returned to battle not for honor or strategy, but for grief. He fought like a storm that had learned precision. He found Hector. The duel was long, fierce, and felt by every soldier who dared breathe near it. Achilles killed him, tied the body to his chariot, and dragged it around the walls of Troy, not from malice, but from something darker loss without outlet. Inside Troy, Priam mourned. Then, in a moment of fragile bravery, he entered the Greek camp at night, guided by Hermes, and knelt before Achilles. He asked for his son's body. Achilles, seeing not a king, but a father, wept. He returned. Hector offered a truce for burial, and let the war pause briefly, not from treaty, but from sheer exhaustion. The siege continued. Years passed, measured in arrows and arguments. The gods, too, took sides, Hera and Athena supporting the Greeks, Aphrodite and Ares favoring Troy, and Zeus pretending to be neutral, while occasionally adjusting the weather. Battles rose and fell. Heroes died often with poetic last words. The Greeks built a massive wall around their ships. The Trojans built stronger prayers. At times, it seemed the war had no center, only repetition. But strategies were forming. Odysseus, never idle, began weaving ideas, and somewhere in the Greek camp, a wooden shape began to take form, not yet a horse, not yet a trick, but the suggestion of an ending, waiting patiently behind the splinters. The campfires along the Greek shore flickered more out of habit than need their smoke curling upward into the indifferent dark like unanswered prayers. It had been nearly 10 years since the Greeks first landed on Trojan soil, and what had begun as a swift campaign fueled by pride and marital contracts had slowly sunk into the rhythm of repetition. Skirmishes continued, of course, arrows loosed without aim, armor polished more from boredom than readiness, and councils held that felt increasingly like rehearsals for speeches no one wanted to give. Agamemnon paced restless beneath his heavy crown of command, while Menelaus still watched the city walls, searching for a glimpse of Helen that he never admitted he hoped not to find. Achilles had fallen, by now slain not in a blaze of swordplay, but by an arrow to the heel shot by Paris, who had assistance from Apollo, though accounts differ on whether the god aimed or merely observed. The death of Achilles shook the Greek camp, though not into action. His armor was claimed by Odysseus, not Ajax, a decision that sparked argument, then rage, then Ajax's lonely death, a hero undone not by battle, but by the quiet erosion of honor. With each passing season, fewer believed the war could end cleanly. It was then that Odysseus, king of Ithaca, strategist, speaker, and reluctant participant in all things dramatic, began to speak less and measure more. He walked the beach, counting paces. He stared at wood, not as material, but as metaphor. He spoke with carpenters in the kind of voice that made people agree before understanding. The plan, when it emerged, did not trumpet itself. It whispered. It sounded absurd, then possible, then inevitable. Build a great wooden horse, large enough to house men, within then pretend to sail away, leaving the horse as an offering, either to Athena or as a token of surrender, depending on who was telling the story and how well they remembered the script. Inside, the horse would hide a select group of warriors, Odysseus among them, along with Menelaus. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, freshly arrived, and determined to prove that legacies did not rest, and others who were chosen not only for bravery, but for the ability to crouch quietly for long periods. The Greeks would burn their tents, break their camp, and set sail just far enough to convince the Trojans that the war at long last had exhausted itself. Construction began in silence. Logs were hauled, shaped, fitted without flourish. The horse grew not majestically, but with the slow determination of a plan that had no other options. Some among the Greeks doubted. Others prayed. Most simply obeyed, too tired to argue. When the horse was finished, it stood awkward and enormous, not quite a statue, not quite a lie, but something balanced precisely between the two. The rest of the army boarded ships and sailed to Tenedos, a nearby island close enough to return quickly, far enough to seem gone. and the horse remained silent still, and somehow dignified. Inside, the chosen waited. Outside, the Trojans approached. At first, they did not believe it. They walked the empty camp, smelled the ashes of the burned ships, and touched the horse as one might poke a myth still in progress. Debate swirled. Some said it was a trick. Others declared it a gift. Laocoon, a priest, warned against it famously, exclaiming that one should fear Greeks even bearing gifts. Then came the snakes, twin serpents that emerged from the sea, coiled around Laocoon and his sons, and dragged them into the waves. It was seen as a sign not of punishment, but of prophecy. The horse must be sacred. It must be brought into the city. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, and cursed to speak true, but never be believed, also warned them. Her cries were dismissed. Her hands were ignored. The gates opened. Ropes were tied. The horse was pulled across the threshold wheels, grinding softly against the stones of Troy. That night, the city celebrated. Fires burned bright. Wine flowed. Songs were sung by those who had survived long enough to sing again. The horse stood in the square, a towering silhouette against the revelry, unmoving and unnoticed. At midnight, when laughter had dulled into murmurs, and the streets were empty, but for the quiet thrum of sleep, a panel opened. Odysseus emerged, followed by the others, each stretching limbs stiffened by hours of stillness. They moved like ghosts. They opened gates. They signaled. From Tenedos, the ships returned sails dark against the night. The Greeks entered. What followed was not a battle, but a collapse. Troy, caught in celebration, fell by fire, sword, and silence. Priam was slain at the altar. Paris died somewhere between defiance and disbelief. Helen, depending on the source, was either reclaimed or simply observed, as if no one could agree what she had become. The city burned. Its towers cracked. Its people scattered. And the war which had begun with a wedding and an apple ended not with peace, but with ash. But Odysseus, standing amid the ruins, did not celebrate. His eyes drifted westward, toward Ithaca, toward home. He did not yet know that his journey back would take 10 more years, and that his story, twisting, wandering, filled with storms and sorceresses and stubborn islands, was only just beginning. The wind that carried the Greeks homeward after Troy smelled faintly of smoke, salt, and endings no one wanted to discuss. Some ships vanished before making it out of sight. Others, carrying heroes too proud or unlucky, would never see their home shores again. But Odysseus, king of Ithaca, man of many turns, speaker of words, that curved like river paths, and plans that coiled like ivy around stone, sailed with 12 ships, and the kind of weariness that doesn't speak so much as sigh through clenched teeth. He longed for Ithaca, not for throne or glory, but for his wife, Penelope, who waited with stubborn patience, and his son Telemachus, who had been a babe when Odysseus left, and was now a rumor of adolescence. The journey, as expected, did not go directly. The first detour came at Ismarus' home of the Cicones, where the Greeks raided the town with the casual brutality of victors who hadn't yet learned to pace themselves. Odysseus advised withdrawal after the initial success, but his men lingered celebrating until the Cicones regrouped and counterattacked. Losses were taken. The ships moved on more slowly, now their sails tugging against guilt. The next stop, unplanned and vaguely scented, was the land of the lotus eaters, where the locals offered flowers that dissolved time and memory. Several of Odysseus's men ate. The lotus smiled vaguely and forgot about home war and why sandals were important. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships, weeping softly, their limbs unwilling, and their minds already adrift in dreams not their own. He tied them down until the island vanished behind them. Then came the island of the Cyclopes, a race of one-eyed giants who lived without laws, neighbors, or any apparent interest in landscaping. There, Odysseus and a scouting party stumbled into the cave of Polyphemus, a particularly large and particularly unfriendly Cyclops. At first, the cave seemed abandoned and well stocked with cheese and livestock. The Greeks helped themselves. Then Polyphemus returned, blocked the exit with a boulder the size of collective regret, and began eating the intruders, 2 at a time. Odysseus, ever resourceful, introduced himself as nobody devised a plan involving wine, a sharpened stake, and the willingness to wait for the right moment. They blinded the Cyclops while he slept, as Polyphemus screamed and thrashed his neighbors, curious but not overly helpful, called out. When he replied, "Nobody is hurting me," they left him to his poetic justice. The Greeks escaped by clinging to the bellies of sheep, as Polyphemus let his flock out. Once aboard the ships, Odysseus could not resist shouting his real name, a flourish that pleased his ego and enraged Poseidon, Polyphemus's father. The sea god took personal offense. The voyage would now be more complicated. Storms followed. The crew sought shelter on the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus, intrigued by Odysseus's tales and the novelty of visitors who didn't break furniture, gifted him a bag containing all the unfavorable winds sealed tight so that only favorable breezes would carry them home. Ithaca appeared on the horizon after days of calm sailing. But curiosity is a persistent disease among sailors. And while Odysseus slept, his crew opened the bag, thinking it contained treasure. The unleashed winds howled, the ships spun, and Ithaca vanished again into the mist. Back they went pleading once more to Iolaus, who this time refused, declaring that any man so cursed was clearly out of divine favor. More wandering followed. They reached the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals with poor hospitality and excellent aim. Boulders rained down on the fleet. Only Odysseus's ship escaped. Morale dipped further. Eventually, they landed on Aia, the island of Circe, a sorceress with a fondness for pigs and leisurely enchantment. Some of Odysseus's men, upon arrival, were promptly transformed into swine, a condition that surprised no one and delighted local metaphors. With help from Hermes, who offered advice and a magical herb, Odysseus resisted Circe's spells. He demanded his men be restored. Circe, impressed or amused, complied. They stayed for a year, feasting, resting, and forgetting time in a way that only people with flexible concepts of responsibility can manage. Eventually, Odysseus remembered home. Circe helpfully advised that he visit the underworld to seek counsel from the dead prophet Tiresias, who would provide directions and possibly closure. Odysseus agreed with the kind of resignation only long-distance sailors develop. They sailed to the edge of the world, performed the rites, and summoned the dead. Tiresias appeared, offered grim advice, and warned Odysseus to avoid the cattle of Helios, the sun god. He also warned that Odysseus would return home alone after many hardships, and that even then, peace would not come easily. Odysseus also spoke with his mother, who had died of grief, with Achilles, who found the afterlife underwhelming, and with Agamemnon, who offered marital advice that doubled as a cautionary tale. Returning to Aia briefly, the crew resumed their journey. Now forewarned, they approached the sirens, whose songs lured sailors to death on sharp rocks disguised by melody. Odysseus, curious but cautious, ordered his men to plug their ears with wax and tie him to the mast so he could listen without leaping. The sirens sang voices draped in longing and secrets, but the ship passed safely. More hazards followed. The narrow strait of Scylla and Charybdis awaited one a six-headed monster perched above the other, a massive whirlpool below. Odysseus chose to sail closer to Scylla, losing 6 men, but avoiding total ruin. Their cries echoed across the strait, then faded into necessity. Exhausted, the crew finally reached Thrinacia, the island of Helios's sacred cattle. Though warned, hunger won. While Odysseus slept, his men slaughtered and cooked the forbidden beasts. The sun god, displeased, complained to Zeus, who sent a storm The ship was destroyed. All perished, but Odysseus, who clung to debris and drifted alone toward the island of Ogygia, where a nymph named Calypso would find him, offer shelter, and begin the next long pause in a journey that refused to finish. The island of Ogygia was not on any map which suited it well, since most maps avoided places where time behaved suspiciously. It rose from the sea like a forgotten idea wrapped in mists and soft vines, its shores too calm to be trusted, and its birds too harmonious for anything practical. Calypso, a nymph of unmeasured years and deliberate solitude, lived there with the quiet contentment of someone who had grown used to sunsets without visitors. When Odysseus washed ashore, salt-crusted, half-drowned, and thoroughly unconvinced that he wasn't dreaming, she did not panic. She simply helped him up, offered him food, and looked at him the way someone looks at a book they might read again, even if they already knew the ending. He stayed, not by force at first, nor entirely by choice. Calypso offered comfort. She offered immortality. She offered a life unburdened by war memory or obligation. And for a while, Odysseus accepted. He wandered the groves. He watched the sea. He slept in a bed not made of ship timber. And yet, each morning, he walked to the shore and stared westward toward a home that no longer felt certain, but which still called to him, like a name mispronounced by distance. 7 years passed in a way that didn't feel like passing. Calypso sang. Odysseus wept quietly into the waves. On Olympus, the gods had begun to notice the length of his absence, not with alarm, but with bureaucratic curiosity. Athena, ever his advocate, gently reminded Zeus that the hero's journey had not yet resolved, and that Penelope, still waiting in Ithaca, had grown famous for weaving and unweaving the same burial shroud each night to delay remarriage. Zeus, distracted but agreeable, dispatched Hermes to Ogygia with instructions. Calypso, upon hearing them, did not argue. She simply frowned, sighed the kind of sigh only immortals truly master, and told Odysseus he was free to go. She helped him build a raft, not a great ship, but a sturdy platform of logs, lashed with vines, and quiet goodbyes. She offered him food, wine, and one last chance to stay. He declined not with joy, but with something heavier. The raft drifted from Ogygia, and the island vanished behind him, like a dream too gentle to wake from. The sea, ever faithful to its own mood swings, did not offer a smooth ride. Poseidon, still wounded by past offenses, and ever sensitive to unfinished revenge, saw Odysseus adrift and summoned a storm. The raft shattered. Odysseus, clinging to wood and will, was thrown across the sea until finally, battered and barely conscious, he washed up on the shores of Sharia land of the Phaeacians, whose reputation for hospitality was only slightly better than their love of long-distance swimming competitions. There he was found by Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous, who had come to the river with her maids to wash linens and returned with a myth. She did not scream. She did not flee. She offered clothing and advice and walked him to the city's gates with the air of someone who had just stepped into a story she wasn't sure how to tell yet. In the palace of Alcinous, Odysseus was welcomed, fed, and eventually asked to recount his tale. He did so not proudly, but thoroughly, the words falling like oars in still water, covering Troy the Cyclops, Circe, the underworld, and the endless delays that had turned a war hero into a very tired sailor. The Phaeacians, moved by his words, and possibly feeling mildly responsible, offered him passage home. A ship was prepared, swift and silent, and Odysseus, at long last, slept on deck under a sail that finally pointed toward Ithaca. While he slept, the ship slipped into harbor and left him gently on the sand. When he woke, he did not recognize the island at first. It had been 20 years. Time had rearranged the landscape slightly, and grief had blurred his memory. But then Athena appeared disguised. At first, then revealed, offering reassurance and strategy. She told him of Penelope's faith, of the suitors who had crowded his hall, and of his son, now grown and restless. Odysseus did not rush home. He did what he always did, he planned. Disguised as a beggar, he entered his own kingdom, unseen, watched the suitors eat and drink and posture, and quietly measured their flaws. He met Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, who offered hospitality without knowing who he served. He met Telemachus, who returned from his own failed journey to seek news of his father, and together in a quiet hut with the smell of animals and ash, father and son reunited, not with speeches, but with tears and recognition unspoken. But Odysseus still waited. The moment to reveal himself had not yet ripened. He watched Penelope from afar, saw her dignity beneath the pressure, her wit beneath the silence. She declared that she would marry whichever suitor could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads, a task designed not for sport, but memory. The suitors tried, failed, and laughed. Then the beggar asked to try. The bow, which had rested untouched for 2 decades, bent easily in his hands. The arrow flew straight, and silence followed, long and final. But not yet. not here. The bow is drawn. The suitors, still unaware, sip wine and speak loudly, and the halls of Ithaca tremble with the quiet before a reckoning, still waiting in the next breath. The moment held, stretched tight across the hearth like a bowstring drawn, but not yet loosed, as the beggar stood in the middle of the great hall of Ithaca, holding a weapon no suitor could lift, and wearing a face none had bothered to look at too closely. Around him, the suitors reclined with the entitled sprawl of men who had made themselves comfortable in someone else's story, their goblets full, their sandals scattered, and their laughter just beginning to fade into a questioning quiet. Penelope, seated at a polite distance, observed with the sort of calm that came from years of practiced patience, though her fingers curled slightly into her robe as if remembering things before her mind gave them words. The arrow had flown true through all 12 axe heads, a feat once ornamental, but now sounding faintly like a drumbeat before battle. The beggar. Odysseus, in truth, in posture, in sudden and unmistakable presence, stood tall, now taller than memory allowed, and turned toward the suitors with an expression that had no room left for negotiation. Without ceremony or extended introduction, he notched another arrow. The first suitor to die was Antinous, a man known more for appetite than intellect, who took an arrow through the throat, mid-sip, his wine mixing briefly with silence and then panic. The others scrambled, shouted, reached for weapons they had left too far from reach. The doors had already been barred. The hall was no longer a room. It was a reckoning. Telemachus, now beside his father, armed and alert, joined the fray. Eumaeus and Philoetius, the loyal swineherd and cowherd, held the exits, their hands firm and their loyalty sharper than any spear. Arrows flew. Words, mostly brief and final, followed. The suitors, once confident in their theft of another man's home, found themselves counted not by lineage, but by error. They fell one by one. Eurymachus, who tried to bargain and found no audience. Amphinomus, who tried to charge and found only a blade. The battle was swift, brutal, and without flourish. It did not celebrate itself. It simply removed the problem. When the final suitor fell, the floor slick with the kind of red that required scrubbing and memory. Odysseus lowered his bow. The quiet returned not as peace, but as aftermath. Then came the maids, those who had sided with the suitors, who had abandoned their queen, not with daggers, but with whispers. Telemachus handled their judgment with a young man's sternness and a prince's burden, while Odysseus watched not with anger, but with the weariness of one who knows justice often carries a broom, not a banner. Penelope, though told that Odysseus had returned, did not rush to embrace him. She had spent too many nights weaving lies into cloth, and too many mornings unraveling them by candlelight. Instead, she tested him, asked about their bed, the one carved from a living olive tree, and unmoved since the day they married. Odysseus answered as only he could, and her eyes filled not with surprise, but with something older and deeper. Recognition is rarely loud. Their reunion was quiet, like rain finally reaching roots that had waited without asking. And yet Ithaca was not yet settled. The families of the slain suitors gathered stirred by grief and the ever-bubbling undercurrent of politics. Athena intervened, smoothing tempers with divine diplomacy and a flash of shield when needed. Peace, cautious and patched with understanding, settled over the island like a quilt with uneven stitching. Odysseus resumed his rule, not with parades, but with slow steps through familiar halls, touching walls he'd once built, and watching servants who now watched him with disbelief turning into memory. Telemachus stood taller, no longer a question, but a presence. The palace, long held by strangers, remembered its shape. But for Odysseus, peace was still provisional. Tiresias's prophecy, heard in the shadowed underworld, still lingered like unfinished paperwork. He had been told that even after reclaiming home, he must journey once more to a place where the sea was unknown, and oars mistaken for winnowing fans. There, he would plant the oar, make an offering to Poseidon, and find a final stillness. But that was later. For now, he walked his kingdom slowly, each day, reacquainting himself with paths he'd once run, faces he'd once kissed, and rooms where echoes had lingered too long. The sea, though quiet, still murmured, and far to the east, another tale was preparing itself, not of war or wandering, but of origin, of a people who would rise from the ashes of fallen Troy, led by a man carrying not vengeance, but a promise. While Odysseus paced the paths of Ithaca, reacquainting himself with walls that remembered his voice better than his face. And while Penelope resumed weaving patterns that now held warmth instead of delay. Another man was walking away from Troy, not as a victor, nor as a conqueror, but as a survivor, tasked with carrying memory, not for himself, but for those who had no strength left to bear it. Aeneas, son of Anchises, and the goddess Aphrodite, had not been the loudest warrior of the Trojan War, nor the most decorated, but he had been consistent, capable, and remarkably good at staying alive, which, in those days, was considered a virtue bordering on strategy. As Troy burned and its towers sighed into ash, Aeneas did not leap into flame for glory. He carried his aged father on his back, held his young son Ascanius by the hand, and gathered what few loyal Trojans remained, not in defiance, but in a kind of steady heartbreak that smelled of embers and unfinished prayers. Behind him, his wife Creusa was lost in the confusion, vanished, mourned, and briefly glimpsed as a ghost who offered permission to let go. So he did. The Trojans wandered. They built ships from whatever still floated. They followed signs, stars, dreams, sometimes just the shape of a bird's flight, and set sail across a Mediterranean that was as indifferent as it was scenic. They landed in Thrace, where they attempted to settle. But the soil bled when tilled, revealing the corpse of Polydorus, a murdered prince, and a reminder that some lands hold grudges more deeply than crops. They left. They reached Delos, sought prophecy, and were told to seek their ancient motherland. Some thought this meant Crete, but the harvest failed, and dreams grew contradictory. They sailed again, their ships no longer pristine, their songs quieter. On the island of Strophides, they met the Harpies, winged creatures who shrieked at every meal and prophesied famine, saying they would not find their true home until hunger drove them to eat their tables. It was not comforting. In Epirus, they found another Trojan, Helenus' son of Priam, who had become a prophet and offered more precise directions. Sail west, avoid Scylla and Charybdis, beware the Greeks, and seek a land where a white sow nurses 30 piglets. It was not less cryptic, but it was at least vivid. They reached Italy, briefly, then Sicily, where Anchises, old and tired, died, and was buried with the kind of ceremony that feels more like a release than a loss. Aeneas wept not with drama, but with the dull ache of someone now forced to lead alone. Then came the storm. Juno, queen of the gods, and lifelong opponent of all things, Trojan, due to Paris's apple and general indignation, had been watching Aeneas's journey with the kind of polite malice only immortals, perfect. She summoned Aeolus. The wind-keeper bribed him with vague promises and unleashed a storm meant to scatter and undo. The fleet fractured. Aeneas's ship, guided by stubborn luck and narrative gravity, reached the shores of Carthage, a new city still soft with fresh stone and ambition. There he met Dido Queen and Founder, who ruled with intelligence, charm, and a subtle loneliness that echoed in the marble of her palace. She welcomed the Trojans, asked for stories, and listened as Aeneas recounted Troy, the fall, the wandering, the gods. Her eyes did not blink too often. The two grew close. Days passed, then weeks. A cave, a storm, a union not formally declared, but gently understood. Dido called it marriage. Aeneas, when reminded by Mercury of his divine mission, called it delay. He left quietly early, without farewell. Dido, betrayed not by his departure, but by the manner of it stood on the shore, watched the sails vanish, and built a pyre. On it she placed his cloak, his sword, the memory of something that might have become a future. She stepped into the flames with the sort of calm that only broken trust can compose. Aeneas, unaware or unwilling to feel the full weight of what had occurred, sailed on. He passed Sicily, again, offered games for his father's death anniversary, lost more ships to storms, and finally reached Cumae, where he consulted the Sibyl, a prophetess, with eyes that saw the underworld clearly, and the future only in riddles. She guided him through the land of the dead, across the river Styx, past Cerberus, through fields of mourning, where he glimpsed Dido again, silent, and turned away toward the Elysian fields, where he found Anchises at peace. His father showed him visions of Rome, not yet built of kings, not yet born of laws, not yet written. Aeneas returned not joyful, but resolved. He sailed up the coast to Latium, where prophecy said he would settle. There he met King Latinus, whose daughter Lavinia was of marrying age. But peace is never unanimous. Turnus, prince of the Rutulians and Lavinia's former suitor, opposed the match. War followed, as it always does, when futures are negotiated without consent. Aeneas fought not for conquest, but for inevitability. He killed Turnus, not with triumph, but with the heavy hand of fate. The Trojans settled. Lavinia married Aeneas. A city rose, slowly, from compromise and ash. Ascanius, his son, would one day found Alba Longa, and generations later, a descendant named Romulus would sketch a city on 7 hills and call it Rome. But for now, the story paused, not with an ending, but with a breath. And far above the gods looked down some satisfied, some still calculating, as another tale rippled softly into being, one that would leave behind Olympus and venture toward philosophy oracles, and a man with a lamp searching for truth in daylight. In the generations that followed Aeneas, the gods found themselves mentioned slightly less in battle plans, and slightly more in conversations held under olive trees, where scholars with uneven beards argued about whether fate could be negotiated, or if it simply wore a different kind of robe. The world was shifting, not suddenly, but with a sort of deliberate slowness, like a cart changing wheels while still moving forward. Temples were still built, of course, wide and white and echoing with offerings, but alongside them, in the shaded porches of places like Athens, people began to speak in long sentences about things like virtue form and whether Zeus had a favorite philosopher. This was the age of oracles and inquiry, when mortals still believed in gods, but also believed in questions. At Delphi, beneath the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the oracle of Apollo sat on a tripod above a crack in the earth, breathing vapors and uttering truths shaped like riddles. She was called the Pythia, and her words, though rarely direct, guided kings, generals, poets, and the very occasional farmer. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world, bearing tokens, sacrifices, and occasionally goats with opinions. They waited in long lines, not unlike travelers at border crossings, each hoping to hear something divine, but also manageable. The Pythia spoke of wars that might be won if delayed, of cities that should not be built near rivers, with opinions, and of individuals who should avoid naming their children after dreams. Her words were transcribed by priests who squinted often and edited little. Socrates, long before his trial, and the cup of hemlock visited Delphi. When asked if anyone was wiser than he, the oracle replied, "No." This disturbed him, not because he believed it, but because it felt like an accusation. He spent the rest of his life interrogating this idea, not to confirm his wisdom, but to find someone who disproved it. He never quite succeeded. His student Plato took these dialogues and arranged them into texts the kind that future students would quote in libraries while secretly checking the time. Plato, too, believed in forms not just of gods, but of chairs, justice, and love, perfect versions that hovered invisibly above the imperfect world, like ideals always slightly out of reach. His own student Aristotle, less enchanted by abstraction, preferred classification. He charted things, defined causes, and organized knowledge into categories that made the world seem less slippery. While others looked to Olympus, Aristotle often looked to nature and asked what things were made of what they were meant to be, and whether purpose could be described in sentences that didn't require incense. During this time, gods were still worshipped, but with increasing formality, like distant relatives, too powerful to ignore, but too inconsistent to consult regularly. Festivals remained lively. Hymns were sung. Offerings were made with sincerity, though occasionally with a hint of obligation. And yet, quietly, mortals began asking questions once reserved for immortals. What is happiness? What is justice? What happens when we die, and should we fear it? Less if we live well? Oracles still whispered. Poets still invoked muses. But alongside them, men in robes debated ethics, metaphysics, and whether knowing oneself required a mirror or just a very long walk. In the agora of Athens, ideas passed from mouth to mouth like bread without crusts. Schools formed not with bells, but with questions, and thinkers disagreed politely, then less politely, then with great determination. The Stoics believed in self-control, that virtue was enough for happiness, and that emotions should be managed like poorly behaved dinner guests. The Epicureans, often misunderstood, did not chase indulgence, but rather freedom from pain, preferring a life of modest pleasures and quiet gardens. The skeptics, ever cautious, suggested that perhaps certainty was overrated, and that suspending judgment might be the most honest act of intellect. Even the gods from their high perches began to notice that fewer sacrifices came with urgent requests. More often, mortals simply left questions at their feet, like stones to be walked around. Temples remained, but minds wandered. And yet, mythology did not vanish. It reshaped itself. Myths were taught not as prescriptions, but as parables. Prometheus became a symbol of rebellion and foresight. Theseus, a study in civic identity. Oedipus, whose tale still turned stomachs, was discussed not only as a warning, but as a case study in fate, free will, and overachieving irony. In theaters, carved into hillsides, these stories were reenacted not to resolve them, but to examine them again, this time with better lighting. Tragedy became a form of thinking. Comedy, a means of self-defense. The gods themselves, once thunderous and jealous, softened slightly, their personalities becoming part of character studies rather than courtroom evidence. In schools across the Hellenistic world, Greek thought spread not by conquest, though conquests certainly helped, but by curiosity. Alexandria in Egypt became a library before it was a city, and scholars there cataloged not just scrolls, but stars, insects, languages, and questions still without answers. Even Rome, rising steadily with its togas and aqueducts, borrowed heavily not only architecture and theater, but thought. Cicero quoted Plato. Virgil wrote Aeneas into a Roman epic. The gods of Olympus found themselves renamed but not erased. Zeus becoming Jupiter, Aphrodite becoming Venus, their stories retold with Roman accents and slightly more ambition. And as marble statues multiplied their eyes, forever unblinking, a new figure began to stir quietly in the eastern provinces, a teacher not of war or rhetoric, but of peace and parables, whose followers would one day rewrite the story of gods and men with sandals instead of sandals and swords. But that whisper still lay ahead, not yet loud, not yet gathered into gospels. For now, the world still turned slowly. Scholars still argued, gently, and the gods watched with the bemused patience of figures beginning to suspect that belief, like memory, might fade gently rather than shatter abruptly as scrolls were copied, and the marble floors of libraries in Alexandria echoed with the footfalls of scholars who spoke in syllogisms. A quieter sound began to rise, not from the lofty halls of debate, or the theaters echoing with the lines of Sophocles, but from the dusty roads of Galilee, where sandals kicked up stories instead of arguments, and where parables shaped not like puzzles, but like folded cloth were passed from ear to ear, remembered not for their cleverness, but for their quiet insistence. A teacher had emerged, not one backed by empire or lineage, but by presence. His name was Jesus, and though his voice was soft, it spoke in a tone that did not ask to be compared to thunder. He did not summon clouds or split seas, but walked instead among fishermen, tax collectors, widows, and shepherds, speaking not of Olympus, nor of muses, nor of golden thrones, but of the poor in spirit, the meek, the peacemakers. Where Zeus roared, this man whispered. Where myths spun tales of gods seducing mortals and flinging bolts across the sky, this one healed with mud, forgave with words, and fed crowds with loaves, more out of empathy than spectacle. Yet the stories that formed around him, simple, tender, sometimes confusing, began to gather their own momentum, the way water slowly fills a basin without fanfare. The Romans, who now ruled from Britain to Judea, largely ignored him at first. He was, in their view, just another voice among the many that rose and fell beneath their cloaks and aqueducts. The Greek gods, renamed but still sculpted in generous stone, stood largely undisturbed in their temples, their festivals scheduled, their incense reliable. But belief, by its nature, does not always declare itself loudly. The followers of this new teacher called themselves not warriors or philosophers, but disciples. They met in houses, shared bread, and repeated his words as if they were not merely teachings, but a way of remembering how to be human. He spoke in metaphors that turned familiar things, seeds, lamps, coins, into moral terrain. He said the last would be first. He said to forgive without counting. He touched the untouchable. He wept at tombs. Eventually, as such figures often do, he alarmed the powerful, not with threats, but with peace, too persistent to be ignored. He was arrested, tried, and executed in a manner reserved for thieves and troublemakers. Crucifixion designed not only to kill, but to humiliate. His followers scattered briefly, then gathered, and told the story again, but this time with a conclusion not quite expected. He had risen, they said, not in mythic glow or chariot of fire, but in presence, quietly, familiarly. They spoke of an empty tomb, of appearances on roadsides and shorelines. And from that moment, the world did not change immediately, but began to lean. The gods of Mount Olympus, though still honored, began to feel slightly less inhabited. Their statues remained, but the offerings grew fewer, the festivals shorter, and the prayers a little less urgent. In back alleys and under colonnades, people met to talk of grace, of mercy, and of one God, rather than many, who did not reside on a peak, but in the hearts of those willing to believe. This monotheism was not entirely good. The Jews had spoken of one God for centuries, but now it spread across languages, across borders, not with swords, but with stories. Paul, a Roman citizen and tireless walker of roads, carried the message to cities whose names were already known from Homer's verses. He spoke in synagogues, forums, and open air, translating not only language, but context, framing the teachings of Christ in terms familiar to Greek ears, casting Jesus not as a rival to Apollo or Dionysus, but as fulfillment, as completion. He argued in Athens, writing letters to Corinth, to Ephesus, to Rome itself. And gradually, belief began to shift, not abruptly, not universally, but gently, like a curtain slowly unhooked. The old myths were not burned or banned. They were still read, admired, even enjoyed. But their hold began to loosen. The pantheon, once crowded with drama and intrigue, began to seem more like theater than theology. Meanwhile, the gospel spread in hidden places, catacombs, courtyards, and eventually cathedrals not yet built. The Christians were persecuted briefly and brutally by emperors more concerned with order than creed. But even the fire and lions could not smother words passed in whispers. Eventually, emperors began to listen. One Constantine would see a vision before battle, a cross in the sky, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He converted, and with him, the empire began its turn. Christianity moved from underground to altar, from whispered prayer to public profession. The temples of Zeus, Athena, and Apollo remained for a time, but their worshippers now walked past them with different prayers on their lips. In Alexandria, once home to scrolls and syllogisms, scholars now debated doctrine. The Council of Nicaea assembled not to ask who threw thunderbolts, but to define the nature of divinity itself in the person of Christ. And slowly, stories once told to explain seasons, stars, and sorrow began to fold themselves into the corners of history. The myths remained engraved, retold, painted, and reenacted, but belief had moved. It had not vanished. It had not declared war. It had simply redirected its gaze. And Olympus, though still standing in stone and poem, began to feel like a museum long before it was ever called one. Yet even in this new light, the old myths did not disappear. They waited patiently, tucked inside the texts of Ovid, the verses of Virgil, the margins of manuscripts that monks copied by candlelight, without always noticing the old stories hiding between the lines. For even in belief's new chapter, memory did not forget how to tell stories. It merely chose a different voice. And far ahead, past empire, past ruins, past scrolls, turned brittle with centuries, a new kind of poet would rise, one who would call upon the muses again, not to revive faith, but to resurrect form, to walk through hell, and speak of paradise, and to remind the world that even as myths changed, the need for meaning remained. Though the temples of Zeus, Apollo, and Athena had long since surrendered to dust and repurposing columns reused as quarry for churches, statues broken, more by time than by intention, the gods did not vanish entirely. They lingered not in incense or invocation, but in books, tapestries, and the corners of frescoes where Olympus lived on more as subject than sanctuary. In medieval Europe, where Christian doctrine reigned, and saints filled the roles once held by demigods, the old myths became curiosities, preserved by scribes who copied Ovid's Metamorphoses not for devotion, but because it was part of the education that noble sons received before they stopped learning and started governing. The Muses, now more metaphor than metaphysical, were occasionally invoked by monks composing Latin verse, their names whispered with a hint of guilt and admiration in dimly lit scriptoria, where letters were illuminated with gold, and marginalia occasionally featured a centaur or a goat playing a flute. Mythology was archived like a dream that polite society no longer remembered having. But then came the Renaissance, a movement less of thunderous change than of rediscovery of forgotten manuscripts, of lost perspectives, of beauty reconsidered. In the libraries of Italy, beneath the dust of centuries, scholars found the old texts Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, and with them the stories of gods who once shaped seasons and hearts. These rediscoveries did not undo Christianity, nor did they dethrone its saints or alter its churches. Instead, they added color to its palette, a wider grammar to its language. Artists like Botticelli, in his painting, The Birth of Venus, did not revive belief in Aphrodite, but rather reclothed her in elegance, placing her once again upon the sea's foam, now framed in Renaissance balance and grace. In Florence, Rome and beyond, sculptors chiseled Hermes not for worship, but for form, for motion, for the curve of calf and winged sandal. The gods became metaphors again, this time for ideas. Mars for courage or conquest, Diana for chastity and the wilderness, Bacchus for freedom, madness, and the careful art of letting go. Writers, too, called them back. Dante Alighieri, in the Divine Comedy, wandered not Mount Olympus, but the Christian afterlife, guided not by Apollo, but by Virgil the Roman poet, whose Aeneid had preserved Aeneas and Troy's last embers. Dante's use of myth was not reverent. It was deliberate, educational structured. His hell contained not Cyclopes, but Ulysses, forever sailing into mystery, punished more for his pride than his plots. Meanwhile, in England, a young poet named Geoffrey Chaucer peppered his Canterbury Tales with allusions to Pallas Phoebus and Jove, often with a wink and a shrug. His world was Christian, certainly, but his stories remembered the old names. The mythology did not return as faith, it returned as language. In the halls of universities, newly founded and increasingly full of young men trying to impress their tutors with quotes, Greek mythology became part of learning. Students read Homer, even if they often read summaries. They diagrammed genealogies of gods, not to praise them, but to organize them. Yet something strange happened in the process of all this academic study. The stories, though softened, became personal again. Shakespeare, centuries later, would write of Venus and Adonis, Pyramus, and Thisbe, Orpheus, and Eurydice, not to canonize, but to humanize. The gods in his hands were sometimes cruel, sometimes comic, but always somehow relatable. They became tools for storytelling, scaffolding for human emotion. Painters in the Baroque era wrapped the old myths in oil and shadow, making Leda Europa and Persephone shimmer with mortal vulnerability. They were no longer divine actors. They were allegories draped in silk reminders of longing and consequence. As the Enlightenment dawned, reason began to push back against the more chaotic parts of myth, yet the gods remained oddly resistant to rational dismissal. Voltaire might scoff at Zeus's philandering, but he still quoted Plato with admiration. Mythology became a shared language for thinkers who no longer believed in divine thunderbolts, but still appreciated a well-placed metaphor. And then, just as it seemed, myth might retire permanently into the back shelves of libraries, the Romantics arrived poets and painters with wild hair and wilder hearts, who saw in Prometheus not punishment, but defiance, not hubris, but heroism. Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote of Prometheus Unbound, giving the Titan a voice that spoke not just to ancient suffering, but to modern rebellion. John Keats, dying young, but dreaming long, wrote of urns and faded gods, as if they whispered to him personally in the twilight. Lord Byron, half myth himself, wandered Greece with a sword and a pen, invoking the gods less as figures of worship and more as ghosts of lost passion. Meanwhile, German thinkers like Goethe reimagined Faust, blending myth with philosophy, crafting a story that asked not what the gods could do for man, but what man dared to do in spite of them. Mythology once again became a vessel not for belief, but for reflection. It was now about yearning, beauty, suffering, and that peculiar human habit of needing stories to understand things the stars don't explain. And even as science bloomed, as telescopes peered into heavens previously ruled by chariots and constellations named for heroes, the names remained. Orion, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, still traced in the night sky, still whispered to children on clear evenings. The myths had lost their temples, their priests and their offerings, but not their voice. They had changed costume, no longer divine decrees, but symbols in poems, icons in paintings, and metaphors in love letters. The gods did not rule, but they lingered. And up ahead, in an age not yet fully imagined, they would find new forms again. Not on altars or scrolls, but on pages turned at bedtime in libraries, filled with fantasy, and in classrooms where bored students still wonder why Narcissus couldn't just look away. But that revival was still forming, still whispering in the margins. For now, the gods sat quietly in museums and footnotes, waiting not for prayers, but for the next story to begin. As the centuries turned and gas lights gave way to electric bulbs, mythology, though long retired from civic duty and public worship, remained oddly present in the everyday murmurs of culture, like a melody barely audible beneath the modern din. In the age of industry, where steam and steel took precedence over prophecy, the gods adapted quietly, not as deities, but as archetypes, blueprints for characters, metaphors, and the recurring dream that perhaps ancient stories still knew something the present had forgotten. Literature led the way, as it often does not, with proclamations, but with plot lines. Writers like James Joyce turned Ulysses, once a name shouted across battlefields, into a Dublin man wandering city streets for a day, his epic internal, his monsters metaphorical. T.S. Eliot, in The Wasteland, laced his verses with fragments of myth and regret, calling upon Tiresias not to foretell the future, but to witness the dull ache of the modern moment. Meanwhile, in classrooms across Europe and America, students learned the names of Zeus, Hera, and Poseidon, not from temples or priests, but from dog-eared textbooks and multiple-choice quizzes. They memorized the labors of Heracles, the fate of Oedipus, and the tragic timing of Orpheus, often without knowing they were reciting the very stories that once shaped calendars and civic law. Mythology, stripped of its ritual, had become part of education, not as belief, but as background. And yet, background has a curious way of returning to foreground. In the early 20th century, as Freud delved into the subconscious, he borrowed heavily from myth, not for theology, but for theory. The Oedipus complex, named after a king who tried to flee prophecy, and instead embraced it, unknowingly became shorthand for tangled family psychology. Carl Jung Freud's more metaphor-friendly successor spoke of archetypes of the collective unconscious of the hero's journey, and in doing so, reinterpreted Persephone, Athena, and Hermes as facets of the human soul, ever recurring, ever relevant. At the same time, artists and playwrights reimagined myth with a modern lens. Jean Anouilh's Antigone, written under Nazi occupation, recast an ancient defiance as a parable of resistance. Tennessee Williams wove the fall of Orpheus into the humid sorrow of the American South. Ingmar Bergman filmed silent gods and waiting mortals in cold Nordic rooms, suggesting Olympus might still exist in the silence between breaths. And then came the screens. The mid-20th century, with its flickering black and white televisions and increasingly colorful cinemas, found in mythology a convenient source of drama romance and consequence. Hollywood embraced Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, and anything involving a sword, a sandals budget, and a monster built from rubber or stop motion. The gods, once unpredictable and morally inconsistent, became side characters, occasionally helpful, often decorative, rarely taken seriously. Yet even through the cheesecloth of spectacle, something lingered. Children who watched Pegasus soar or saw Medusa's glare remembered not belief, perhaps, but recognition. In comic books, mythology found perhaps its most unexpected second wind. Wonder Woman, daughter of Hippolyta, trained by Amazons, fought for justice in a world that had almost forgotten how to spell. Ares, let alone fear him. Thor lifted from Norse rather than Greek tradition, but kin to the Olympians, in stature and storm swung his hammer into the Marvel universe. Even Hercules made appearances, muscled, boastful, usually in need of better dialogue. These were not the gods of altars and temples, but they were gods, nevertheless reborn in panels, battling metaphors. Then came books. In the early 21st century, mythology became bedtime reading again. Authors like Rick Riordan introduced Percy Jackson, a modern demigod navigating both high school and the baggage of a divine lineage. Young readers learned the Greek pantheon not from hymns, but from lightning bolt chases and cafeteria fights with harpies. The stories were retold not with solemnity, but with sarcasm, which it turned out was an excellent way to make Hades memorable. And all the while, the language of myth trickled into the culture, not loudly, but steadily. We still speak of Achilles' heels, of Herculean efforts, of Pandora's boxes, and Trojan horses. Politicians are likened to Icarus, rising too fast. Scientists invoke Prometheus when debating the ethics of innovation. Even the moon, once a celestial mystery, was approached by astronauts who named their ships Apollo, and who upon landing quoted poetry rather than physics. Mythology in the modern world became less about worship and more about resonance. It became the place where memory and metaphor met, where ancient fears found modern costumes, and where gods, though no longer prayed to, were still remembered when looking up at the stars or deep into one's own reflection. Museums held their statues, Athena with her owl, Hermes mid-stride, Artemis with bow drawn, and tourists took photos, not because they believed, but because they felt faintly that the marble still whispered. And yet, in every retelling, whether in novels, operas, graphic novels, or video games, something original lingered. The myths, though adapted, retained their shapes, quests, transformations, punishments, redemptions. They offered not answers, but templates. They reminded us that even in an age of algorithms and satellites, the old questions still mattered. Who are we? Where are we going? And what stories will carry us there? And so, as screens glowed in bedrooms and Greek vases stood unblinking in galleries, the gods of Olympus remained no longer above us, perhaps but within reach, waiting not for sacrifices, but for the next curious reader to turn a page. As the 21st century stretched further into a future once imagined only by science fiction, the Greek myths, now millennia removed from their sacred origins, found yet another shape to inhabit, not in scrolls, nor in temples, nor even in paperback editions, lined with student annotations, but in code, in pixels, in the strange ether of the internet, where attention flickers and memory is outsourced to search engines. Yet even here, amid touchscreens and streaming feeds, the old stories continued to surface, not with fanfare, but with the quiet tenacity of symbols that had learned how to persist through every medium so far invented. In online forums, essays explored the psychological profile of Hera. Debates unfolded about whether Achilles had truly been a hero, or simply a deeply traumatized young man with a god complex. And TikTok creators turned Medusa from a monster into a misunderstood symbol of vengeance and autonomy. These weren't temples exactly, but they were sacred in a new way, spaces where storytelling, reinterpretation, and the need to see ourselves reflected in ancient mirrors flourished. On podcasts, scholars and hobbyists alike dissected Odysseus's moral ambiguity, the architecture of Hades, or why Narcissus might have just needed therapy and a slightly more supportive social circle. And with each conversation, the myths breathed again, not in unison, but in echoes, each one tailored to the context of a generation seeking meaning in a world where the gods no longer punished hubris with lightning, but where hubris still burned bright in headlines and hashtags. Video games let players step into the sandals of Kratos, a fictional warrior stitched loosely to Greek mythology who waged war against gods in a universe thick with vengeance and stylized tragedy. Meanwhile, educational games for classrooms allowed students to rebuild temples, solve riddles from the Sphinx, or navigate the underworld with carefully chosen dialogue trees. Myth became interactive, less a story told to you, and more a world you explored, shaped, and sometimes restarted. In film, Olympus returned as a backdrop, sometimes grand and glowing, sometimes crumbling and ironic. Directors used myth to ask big questions with elaborate CGI. What does it mean to be immortal in a mortal world? Can a demigod truly belong? And why even now does the story of Icarus still feel uncomfortably familiar every time a billionaire builds a rocket? In classrooms, students continued to read Homer, though often with accompanying YouTube summaries and digital annotations. Teachers explained the Iliad in the same breath as memes trying to bridge the dusty past and the distracted present. Students still asked why Paris couldn't just pick someone less complicated than Helen, or why the Trojans accepted a suspiciously oversized wooden gift? These questions, while modern in phrasing, echoed the same puzzled curiosity that has always accompanied myth. What were they thinking? Would we have done the same? Beyond the classroom myths cropped up in unexpected places. Marketing campaigns borrowed the gravitas of Olympus to sell watches, sneakers, cologne. A car might be named after a titan. A sports team might invoke Sparta, conveniently forgetting how that story ended. Mythology became shorthand for strength, speed, beauty, but rarely for consequence, irony, or loss. Still, it was there. Always, it was there. In therapy sessions, archetypes, Jungian, mythic, symbolic, were used to map the inner life. Who is your inner warrior, your trickster, your wise old guide? These questions brought Athena, Hermes, and Chiron back into the conversation, not as beings outside us, but as patterns within. In literature, retellings flourished. Novels like Circe by Madeline Miller reimagined the witch not as villain, but as survivor. The Song of Achilles cast love where earlier tales had placed only fate and fury. These versions did not replace the originals, but offered companionship, a hand extended across centuries, saying, "What if we looked again?" In poetry, Eurydice found her voice. In plays, Phaedra took the spotlight. In essays, Persephone was analyzed as a seasonal metaphor, a psychological model, a symbol of growth and return. The gods themselves, now mostly quiet in liturgical terms, still appeared in names, metaphors, and digital avatars. Zeus was no longer prayed to, but occasionally referenced during thunder. Hermes, patron of travelers and messages, found new resonance in logistics companies and internet servers. Dionysus attended music festivals in name, if not in spirit, and Apollo still lived in every discussion of art and medicine. Even Eros, child of chaos and desire, showed up frequently, though most people now called him Cupid, and met him on dating apps. And through all this, the myths adjusted. They didn't complain. They had seen worse. They had survived being banned, burned, ignored, and remixed into musical numbers. Their strength was not in dogma, but in adaptability. They could be sacred, or silly, serious, or symbolic. They could be tragedy, comedy, fantasy, or footnote. They could even be bedtime stories. And indeed, in bedrooms across the world, parents still told their children of Pegasus, of Hydra, of Theseus, and the Minotaur, not because they believed, but because the stories still worked, still taught, still comforted. And somewhere in the layered hush of screens, pages, and dreams, a child might close their eyes to a story of a goddess or a hero or a fall from the sky, and sleep not with the fear of divine punishment, but with the soft awareness that stories never truly die. They just wait for someone to ask them again. And as that child drifted into sleep far away, perhaps in a quiet museum or a forgotten corner of a library, a statue might smile, not widely, not proudly, but knowingly, as if to say very gently, "You're still listening.